Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Today, I'm talking about Spec first API development with OpenAPI. So before I start, who gets an API? You get an API, you get an API, everyone get an API. So you need to build an API. Where do you start? The clients, the database, the code. What about documentation? What about testing, validation? And you need to change something. If it sounds familiar to you, then this talk is for you. My name is Thai Tran, and I'm a solution architect and a backend team lead from Luminary. Our headquarters is in Melbourne, but we also operate in other cities of Australia, including Brisbane, Wodonga, and also in Bali, Indonesia. You can find more information about me from my profile on my company website and get in touch with me via my email address, thai@luminary.com. In 2021, Luminary is proud to be recognized as a B Corp. A B Corp or benefit corporation is a business that has committed to making decisions that have a positive impact on its workers, customer, community, and the environment. Our mission is making the human experience brighter. One of the many ways we accomplish to become a B Corp is being able to eliminate plastic bottles and takeaway cups in our offices and replace them with reusable bottles and keep cups. Given that one day we launch a marketing campaign and give away our brand keep cups, winter hoodies, t-shirt, and washable face mask, we also need to build an application to let our customer and employees to sign up, sign in, order their giveaways, and keep track of their orders. The designer has finished their visual design and handed it over to our development team to implement the website. So we're going to start our development lifecycle with 4 steps: analyze, architect, implement, and document. So let's say we finished analyzing our requirements. Now we can move to the second step, which is architecting our solution. We decide to build our application using Jamstack architecture, so our backend developers will need to build a REST API for the front-end application to render. So the API needs to handle different services, including authentication, payments, commerce, or search. And this is why we need to build an API. So when building an API, it is important for us to choose the right tools, and we need to consider some relevant aspects such as scalability, maintainability, security, and documentation. So we choose to use ASP.NET Core because it is a great framework and that can give us powerful and easy to use API to achieve our goals. So this talk will have 2 parts. In the first part, I will show you how to build a simple REST API using the ASP.NET Core framework. And then in the second part, we will learn how to use the Swagger documentation tool to document our API. So to implement our API, a REST API can be created in .NET Core in 3 easy steps: configure the services, build a controller, and run the solution. So we're going to start with the first step, service configuration. So you can create a new .NET Core solution via a command line, or you can also create a new solution from a template in Visual Studio. The template will create a startup files in your project folder. The startup file in .NET Core is similar to the global ASX in .NET Framework application. So the startup file can contain 2 methods, a configure service method and a configure method to let you configure the services to be used with your application. To add a REST API to your project, you need to make the service collection discover your controller during the application startup. So to do this, we just add this line of code into the configure services method. So next, you need to move to the configure method. In this method, you can enable the routing middleware in your application. In addition, you will need to configure the default routing for your controller endpoints. As you can see, the configuration is pretty simple, and it can be quickly done in just a few lines of code. Now we have finished configuring our service. We're ready to build our first controller for our API. So for instance, we need an endpoint to let the user read and update their profiles. We will start by creating some models. Our profile get output model is just a simple class in C#. It can have 0 or many attributes or properties. Since we have an output model, we can now create our first controllers in the controller folder. We call it profile controller. It is important that in MVC, you will need to follow a naming convention, as it requires your class name to have the controller suffix. You will need to make your profile controller inherit the controller class. In .NET Core, you can add the API controller attribute to your controller to make it an API controller. Very simple. You can also add the route attribute to provide a custom routing path to your API controller endpoints. And you can also use the produce attribute to describe the response format for your API. So let's create our first action to get the user profile data from the API. An action of a controller needs to be a public method, and it can return an object that implements the iActionResult interface. And you will also need to give your action a name to the code. You can construct a new profile getOutput instance inside the get action and return it as a JSON result. So with this simple code, we're ready to run our first API application. If you use the same setting that I've shown you before, you can make an API call a HTTP request to your profile API by entering /API/profile after your domain name in a web browser or in Postman to view the result. And here's an example of the response you will get from your API. I hope that you can follow this simple step to build many REST API for your projects in .NET Core. This is Ben Morris, a London-based software architect and blogger. According to Ben, architecture without documentation is incomplete. This is very important for developers at Luminary, as we have a large development team to build website for a number of clients. Having a good documentation will help us to improve the communication between our developers and other vendors. So who like writing documentation? Nobody? Documentation can't be out of date if there is no documentation. That means the documentation must be accurate. So how did you know this is a bad documentation? Bad documentation, you often receive the feedback from people, it's too long to read, totally useless, not updated. Text editors such as Google Docs, Notepad, Confluence, spreadsheets are great for technical writing, but they are not the best options for API documentation. It can be worse when sometimes the developer had to write a schema endpoint to describe their APIs. It was not only time consuming, but also less maintainable. Others are just reluctant to write documentation because it's just boring. So why documentation? Why bother writing documentation for our API? Let's think about this. You finish the API iteration. The endpoints change or disappear. The client is out of date. And as a result, test fails. This is when we need an API specification. So OpenAPI specification is an API description format for REST APIs. You may have heard about other specs such as API blueprint, RAM, or JSON schema, but I prefer using OpenAPI. So OpenAPI, formerly known as Swagger, but it is now called OpenAPI. An OpenAPI files allow you to describe available endpoints and operations such as get, post, put, delete of your API. You can also describe the schema for the request and the response model for each operation. It lets you describe the authentication methods for your operation. And in addition, you can add your contact information, license, terms of use, and other information to your API. So API specifications can be written in YAML or JSON, and therefore the format is easy to learn and readable to both humans and machines. For this reason, adding an API, an open API to your project can reduce the amount of time that you need to accurately document a service. There are many tools developed for the open API format, supported by a very active developer community. So Swagger is just one of them. Swagger is a set of open source tools built around the open API format that can help you design, build, document, and consume the REST APIs. The major Swagger tools include the Swagger UI, which can be used to generate an interactive API documentation page that lets your user try out the API calls directly in the browser. So Swagger CodeGen will let you to generate the classes and operation from an open API spec. And this is very helpful when you work with a third-party vendor and you want to make sure that you can validate their schema before you use their services. They can just give you the Swagger JSONs, and you can use Swagger CodeGen to generate the strong type classes, and you can use it in your C# so that you, in your solution, so that you don't have to implement your C# classes manually. Swagger Editor is a browser-based editor that allows you to write or edit the open API spec from your browser. And the two main implementations for .NET are Swashbuckle and NSwag. So I use both of them. They are very similar. The only difference is that NSwag is only supported in .NET Core. So let me show you how you can install and use NSwag to enable Swagger for your application. So to install and use Swagger in .NET Core, you can achieve it in 3 simple steps: install NSwag NuGet, configure the middleware, and run the application. You can run a command line to install NSwag NuGet package for ASP.NET Core, or you can install from the NuGet package library. Let's move on with the second step using Swagger. So the first step for us is to configure the middleware. Now we go back to our startup files in our solution, and in the configure services method, you need to enter a new line and add the Swagger document to your service collection. The second step is to move to the configure method, and now you need to use the OpenAPI middleware. And you also need to enable the Swagger UI 3 middleware in your application. And now you're ready to run your Swagger. So to launch the Swagger UI, you need to enter Swagger after your domain name in your browser. So I would like you to pay attention to some important section which can be customized in the following screen. So on the screen, you can see the API information, then the endpoints, the models, the authentication part. You can do so much with this. Assume that you will need to add an update action to your controller and let user update their profile. You can also add some data attribute to customize your action requirements. For example, you can make it only accept post requests and have a custom routing template. So just think about documentation. OpenAPI is just a contract. Your schema is a contract. Your controller action is a contract. You can also use Swagger response data attribute to describe the response model for your action. So in this case, you can see that on my screen, I'm saying that, okay, if my action return 200 response status code, I will return you that result schema, and that's it, the description that you will see on Swagger UI. So let's take a look at the Swagger response attribute. It allows you to add the custom value for status code, description, and the type of the response. So for example, let's check out the result. You can define different status code and different schema, and you can send it to your front-end application so that they can code it for those schema in the application. Unauthorized request, or it's just a page not found, or it can be an internal server error as well. As I said earlier, you can use OpenAPI to describe the request model schema and the response model schema for your API operation. We can apply the data attribute on our model properties. So for example, I can make the first name field as a required input field in the profile update output. And I can also have a custom error message if the field input is invalid. Or you can enable the email validation or use regular expression to validate your user input. The JSON schema extension data attribute allow you to show the example of the field input in Swagger UI. So here's the result. So you can see that in my input model, I can define the required field in the input model. I can give them the example data so that will help our developers to test my API. And if they try to submit some invalid data, they will receive the errors, which is an object that gives you what fields is invalid and the custom message for those invalid input. Authentication. So just because an API isn't public, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. You don't want to make your profile API public so that your user developer must be authorized to view their profiles. So to enable authentication for your API, you can add a custom authorization filter. So a custom action filter can be created as a class in C#, and it needs to inherit the action filter attribute. Then you need to override the on-action execution async method to implement your authorization logic. So for example, if you're using JWT, you can write your code to compare the JWT token in this method. And the second step is to register the filter. Now we need to go back to the startup files. In your startup file, just right after the line where you add the controllers, you can say services.addScope and you pass in your custom action filter. The third step is to update Swagger configuration. So now you need to go to the configure method in your startup. You need to add the operation processor. You need to add the document processor. And the last step is to add the filter to the controller. So as a result, you can see if you run the application again, you go to Swagger UI, you will be able to see the authorized button and to call a protected method in your API. Your front-end developer needs to pass in a JWT token. Otherwise, they will get an unauthorized error. So the last thing you want to do is to customize the versions and the contact information for your API. So let me show you how it can be done in the application startup. So in your Swagger document configuration, you can add a new configuration. And here you can provide the versions of your API. You can have a custom title, some description, term of service, and you can put in your contact information or your license information for your API. And here you can see your data come up in Swagger UI. So that is the end of my talk. So in this talk, I've shown you how easy it is to create a REST API in .NET Core. We also learned about the OpenAPI specification and how to configure the Swagger UI tool for our application. Here's another quote from Ben Morris. One of the most important architectural disciplines is being able to express complex designs in a simple, accessible format. When you remember this quote, remember to document your APIs and keep your documentation up to date. So thank you for listening.